There we go. And then your own time, Jason. I think you're on mute, Jason.
Give me a second. I've lost my. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're back. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for joining me here today. I'm Jason Hilton, Professor of Paleobotany and Paleoenvironments at the University of Birmingham, which is, of course, many of you will be familiar with. And I'm glad to see, looking through the list of the audience, a number of my past students are present. I still remember your names. So I hope this kind of gives you a nice flashback to your time at the University of Birmingham. I'm going to be talking today about a project I've been working on for more than 10 years in particular, but in a broad sense, probably about 20 years leading up to this, which is the Permian vegetational Pompeii, or Pompeii, as it's called. And this is a really exceptional fossil site in North China, which is preserved into volcanic ash. And this is a combination of a large amount of work that's happened over many years and is not something I've done myself. It's been done in collaboration with a large team. This is a project led by Professor Wang Jun from Nanjing Institute of Geology, Paleontology and Stratigraphy of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and his former PhD students Wei Ming and Dan Dan, who I also co-supervised, and my long-standing friend, Professor Wang Shijun, who I first met in 1996 when we wrote a paper together. And we've been working ever since. This is also based on field work that's happened over 8 or 9, maybe 10 years now, which I haven't been able to participate in. And this has basically involved more than 100 individuals so far. The work is in collaboration with Professor Herman Pfefferkorn in the University of Pennsylvania, and a large team of paleobotanists and palynologists from the Czech Republic, of which Jiří, Stanislav, Josef, Milan, and Jana are some of the key players. But in more recent years, it's also spread out to a collaborative network of colleagues, including Mario and Leila in the University of Vienna, working on some of the plants. And also my colleagues in China University of Mining and Technology in Beijing, where we've been working independently but overlapping on paleoenvironments. And this is really bringing us into, a real range of materials. And I guess this is something that I'd like to start off with. I work on fossil plants, and they're really going to be the evidence I'm talking about today. And most of what we see of fossil plants from the fossil record is very fragmented and broken down into the bits and pieces. See lots of natural processes in plant life, like leaves being shed or pollen, and seeds or fruit being dropped and dispersed. But there are also a number of other processes. Animals can come in and disturb things. But we also have processes like, volcanoes exploding, river jams and material. So really the job of paleobotanists is to try and put this disarticulated material back together. Sometimes it's possible, in other times it isn't. And I like to compare the fossil plant record as to someone putting a plant through a shredder, and the paleobotanists are going through the bits and pieces, trying to stick it back together to work out what the actual plant looks like. Sometimes we can, other times we can't. Lots of natural and physical processes are set against us. So this is a slide I use in most of my talks. So I talk about fossil plants, it underpins it. This is from a paper I did with Richard Bateman in 2009, but it's based on work of many others. So here's a fossil plant in the rock record. And basically, we very rarely would see the whole thing preserved. And we have different names for the stems, over here, the branches, the roots, and the different bits and pieces, because we normally find them fragmented. So a single fossil plant can comprise of 10 to 12 definable parts, and for necessity, each one of them has a separate name. But finding one part doesn't necessarily mean we'll get the other parts. And sometimes the plants have different combinations of things. So to work out what the individual species are is really difficult. So if you put that back together with our disarticulation, the job of the paleobotanist is painstaking and laborious, building up our idea of what the whole plant looked like. So this is what we probably understand. This is a really great diagrammatic reconstruction of an early Carboniferous forest in southern Scotland from the National Museums of Scotland. I like this one because it shows the sediments, the riverbanks, the levees, and where the different plants were. And it also shows an open canopy, not these dark, squalid places we often see. But this kind of reconstruction is based on many years of work and data, and often artistics' interpretation of what they think it might look like based on a living forest. That may or may not be true. So the question is, how accurate are these? Some might be, others might not be. So I'd like to kind of float out the idea that this is a hypothesis of a reconstruction rather than an actual reconstruction. I'm going to be today talking about the fossil floras from the early Permian of China. And this is something where before we had this locality that I'm going to talk about today, most of our fossils were preserved as compressions. This is where a fossil plant has fallen on the surface. That's then been inundated by sediment, and our fossil plant is preserved as a flattened morphological compression. These are abundant, not very useful for paleoecology because they're typically fragmented, no anatomy, and it's a real challenge. On the other hand, we get really great preservation in what are called coal balls. We also get these in the UK in our coal seams. These are carbonate concretions which preserve the anatomy. But these have limited occurrences. They do preserve the cellular details. You see here some wood, some really spectacular bands on it. But this isn't actually preserving what was on the surface. This is preserving the in situ peat. So there's lots of rot and decay. And again, they have limited paleoecology utility, very hard to reconstruct what the flora looks like. Then in North China, in around 2000, I was lucky enough to work with colleagues when we discovered volcanic ash. This is a coarse-grained volcanic ash containing exceptionally preserved fossil plants. This here is a seed about 2 centimeters in length. And you can see here there's some glands full of resin. And these are absolutely amazing. But unfortunately, the entire material we have of this, you could put in a carrier bag and have lots of space left in. So exceptionally rare and limited, but amazing. But the downside is, if I go back to one of my previous slides, this is preserved somewhere like this from a volcanic ash has come off a volcano and it's been transported and broken and very, very small sizes. So we can't really reconstruct the source flora. So we've got lots of patchy pieces of evidence, but it's very, very hard to go and put it back together to work out what the floras look like. Now we're stepping back into the late Carboniferous and early Permian world. Here's a simplified diagram of our plate tectonic configuration. And Europe and North America that you'll all be familiar with and where we are in our normal situation, lurking somewhere, I assume, around here. Well, it's quite hard to say, and this is rather stylized. But this is when we talk about North China was believed to be an island. It might have been at various stages touching into the southern parts of the Russian and the southern Russian states. But this is separate from South China as another island, and the two of them together are placed into the Carthaginian realm. And this is an equatorial region, basically around the Paleo-Tethys Ocean. Now, this is something which is very different, and most of what we'll be familiar with in the UK is our geological successions from Europe and North America, which tend to form our view of what the Permian was like. You mentioned the Permian, someone from the UK, they just automatically think of red beds, no fossils, a period of deserts and rapid rainfall and wadi erosion. And you're probably right in this region. But I'm going to introduce you how it's very different in another part of the world. So this is something that I'd like to now introduce. This is the stratigraphic range going through the Carboniferous here in the Permian, showing you the stratigraphic range and approximate extent of peat-forming swamps. Call them coal swamps if you like, but of course, plants form peat. Coal is formed by diagenesis. They would have been peat swamps, and these would have then changed through diagenesis to coal. They start earliest in Europe and go all the way to and a few little pockets of them hanging on into the earliest Permian. America, well, they, like some things like World War II, they joined late and left early, but did it in a kind of a big way. And then we see a regional loss of these floras. It used to be considered as an extinction around the Carboniferous-Permian boundary. We now know that's a regional loss. We know that some of these taxa made it. They went all the way around the northern Tethyan Ocean around here and ended up in North China. And at some stage, there seems to be an overlap in the middle part of the Pennsylvanian, the Moscovian into our old Westphalian, as many of you might know it, and selective entries. And these go through in North China up into the into the early part of the Middle Permian. And then we get a migration from north to south as the continents collide, basically around the Middle Permian. And we see these floras was passing through. But the relationships are contentious. And in this particular time, I'm going to be focusing on this particular interval here, looking at one bed, because that one bed is telling us more information than all of the other locations put together. Now, why is this important? Well, this is some work which is a manuscript in progress, which we're hoping to submit in the next few weeks. And this is something, again, going through the same sequence. Here's the Carboniferous, the Casimovian, the Gazzellian. So this is the old Stephanian up here. This is the Carboniferous-Permian boundary here. And this shows a number of different things. I know I put lots of different things in at the same time. This is a study in part of North China. And this column to the right is showing us it's a proxy for volcanism. We're using the element mercury and normalized to total organic carbon. And the more mercury is telling us it's released from volcanism, and it's telling us something really strange is happening, and really massive volcanic input around and immediately before the Carboniferous-Permian boundary. We're also seeing a massive change in the carbon cycle. These lines here are from different study sites, and they're both showing us a massive drop in the carbon cycle coming up to it, telling us something really dramatic is happening on major. And this seems to be linked to the volcanism. Lots of things we're seeing a drop in our weathering. This is measured by clay materials on land. And we see at the same time our weathering rates really slow down, tell us something's drying out. And we put this together to go and show us it's a really massive long-term drop in temperature at around the Carboniferous-Permian boundary. That then links in and happens at the same time as the start of glaciation in our southern continents. We see our CO2 level is predicted to drop. And our current study is suggesting this is a volcanic winter lasting probably 500,000 years to maybe even 1 million years. And we're going to be looking at a fossil assemblage right in here at this horizon here, which is a critical time when we've gone from a relatively warm period into a cold period. This volcanism, we think, is related to large igneous province volcanism. I'll probably show that better. And in the next slide. And this is what we think is happening. This is the block North China, sorry, would be in a little island slightly off here. I should have got to draw and get this blue patch open. This is what we think at the moment. The Skagerrak large igneous province produces large amounts of volcanic gases, causes heating normally. But we also get large amounts of sulfate aerosols, which are causing cooling. And we're talking about our basin in North China, which is dropping things, and our land and our flora is around here. And this is what I'm going to be talking about today. And we're going to be relating all of the things we're talking about to studying at a real critical time in Earth history, when we're seeing volcanism driving changes in climate. This will also be linking in with Earth's natural cyclicity when we're going into an ice age. It's just that the volcanism seems to have overpinned that and done some really strange things I'm going to talk about through this talk. So this is the locality I'm going to be introducing you to. This is an early Permian locality in North China. So this is our outline of China, and this is where our Inner Mongolia is. Our locality is called Wuda, and this is our total locality. This is the extent of a coal mine, and we've been lucky enough to work with the coal mining company. As they've been moving sequentially through the coal mine, we've been able to do a number of excavations over the last decade to collect and sample the forest and to work with this team. And this is something on a scale which has not previously been seen before. And it's really absolutely a stunning opportunity to really kind of look at the scale of what the plants were growing, where they were growing, and to look at the kind of information to build up much better analyses. Now, for many of you who are really kind of more geological background, we're going to be talking about what's called the Tai-Yuan Formation. And with the locality we're looking at is Wuda, which is up here, the northern margin, mountain range up here, the Inner Mongolian Uplift and other mountains. And to the south east, we have an ocean, so a land-sea transition. And at different, when I started working, people were always telling me, whenever I wrote a paper on Tai-Yuan Formation, we were always squabbling about whether it's Carboniferous or Permian. Well, actually, it's both. We've now got radiometric dates, which are these red lines going through here. And in the Wuda location, virtually all of our Tai-Yuan Formation was deposited in the Carboniferous, just a little bit in the Permian. But if we move across and moving further south, it's a diachronous succession. And the formation was deposited at different times in different places. And you can see about little over half of the Tai-Yuan Formation was deposited in the Carboniferous. And by the time we move over to the Wudaeophyton coal field, right at the south of the area, you'll find here that all of the Tai-Yuan Formation was deposited in the Permian. So this is why we've always had problems dating it. It's because it's diachronous. So we're going to be looking at this one and the Tai-Yuan Formation. We're going to be looking right at the top of the basal part of the Permian time period for our succession. Now on to the flora itself. This is a photograph of Wang Jun, our project leader, and our project collaborator, Herman Pfefferkorn, who did all the pioneering work. They recognized this was a volcanic ash horizon and were clever enough to go and measure it and study it and sample it. It's a 66 centimeter ash bed that's relatively uniform throughout the basin. We've dated it based on zircons to 299 million years with a very, very narrow error range. And this is amazing because it's occurring on top of a coal seam. There's the ash bed, and then there's coal on top of it. And it basically represents a single time plane. And it's basically preserved the peat-forming plant community in their growth environment throughout the entire basin. And the coal mining company are very good. They clear off the coals and just leave us the ash bed. We go and work through it. Then they take out the lower coal. So far, we've been studying lots of things. We've so far studied around 8,000 meters squared of quadrats, systematically studied since 2007 by a joint Chinese and Czech research team. It is one of the largest and most impressive paleobotanical excavations and projects that's out there. And after more than a decade, we're now starting to really take the rate of publication up and bring this through to its natural end. Why do we call it a Pompeii? Well, many people find it really easy to understand what happened in Pompeii, or a Pompeii, a volcanic rock that's basically flooding or smothering an area and having an intact information underneath it. And in this particular case, you can see here it's preserving in immense detail things that simply have not survived elsewhere. In this case, including some of the life forms and these people. Luckily, we didn't need to ask for their permission to include them in photographs. I think we're about, well, quite a few millennium too late for that. So this is what we're talking about. Our volcanic Pompeii is just as important as Pompeii itself and is really revolutionizing our understanding of coal swamp, peat-forming plant communities. This is what the succession looks like. This is a photograph. This is from Wang Jun and Pfefferkorn and colleagues' paper in 2007. This is what we see going through the sequence. This is the base of the first. This is the start of the peat forming community that then went to build the coal. This is the number 7 coal seam. And then we have the flora, the volcanic ash horizon that basically stopped the coal. Our volcanic ash flora, the one we're really looking at, is the ones which is basically preserved right on the base of this. This is the climax vegetation of the coal swamp at this time period, smothered in the volcanic ash. And then after the volcanic ash, we see some small plants coming in and colonizing. This is at the base of here is the colonization and revegetation. And at the end of this is basically where we go to see a coal swamp, which has basically then flooded and turned into a lake environment. And for each of these ones, I put a Roman legionnaire in here for scale, so you can see the style of it. In this case, as the swamp and the plants getting taller, clearly, if you take this as 1.80 meters, something like that, you're seeing the scale of the plants. And in this particular case, at the end, this Roman legionary is very good at swimming because the water eventually deepens, and he'd have had a very, very bad day. So we're actually really lucky to be able to study the succession of vegetation, but most of our information is on this one flora number 2 at the base of the succession. Now, field work in a working coal mine is really good. You don't have to worry about just collecting little bits and pieces. They pull in the big heavy machines for us and clear off the bits we want in pre-agreed areas. And it's very nice and information. So this is what's happening. In this case, the coal on top of the volcanic ash is being stripped off. And then our team come in, and what we do is lay down our quadrats, which are aligned north to south, and everything is numbered. And then we'll go through and start to dig through it to go and find out what is, where all the plants are, and go and systematically record it. And then we'll go and basically continue through the area and go and take off other materials. This is the next stage of it, where we're taking out, in this case, taking out the individual blocks, and you can then go and turn them upside down to see what you want to look at. Depends where we are, we can go to work down through it, or we can basically turn it upside down to look at what the plants are. We can also compare what's at the base of the tuff. Because of the scale of it, if you want a particular block, I'll have that one, stick it on the back of a lorry, take it to a nearby warehouse for analysis, or stick it in, transport it back to our labs in Nanjing in South China. This is a scale of operation which I would dream of doing in the UK, but it's just not going to happen. The health and safety paperwork for a start would be rather obstructive, but let's not go there. This is now onto some of the plants. This is one group of plants that you won't be familiar with for the British coal measures. It's a group called the Noeggerathiales. Yes, they have one of the worst names, but they're really kind of enigmatic groups. They've been recognized for over 100 years, and we've never really known what plant group they are. It's what I call a taxonomic football. They've been kicked around from one affinity to other. We thought they were spenopsids, different groups of ferns related to seed plants, you name it, they've been thought about it. But we haven't known because they've always been found fragmentary. From Wuda, we've actually got 3 different species, 2 of one called Paratingia, which is one of Tingia. And we're lucky to have multiple whole plants preserved, as well as the shed leaf litter on the left. So this is the crown of a tree. And this bit here is, this is a scale bar in here. But this specimen here is about 1.70 meters from the top to the bottom of the tree. And it goes from a vegetative axis of these are the leaves coming off. Here are its fertile zones, and at the top it has another crown of leaves. Turns out it's a tree fern, and we can now go and reconstruct it and work out exactly what it is. Previously, we've only found the bits and pieces, but now we can see what they are. But even better than that, they often have the anatomy preserved, so we can cut them and look at the internal structures. So here's some of the details. Here's some of the characteristic leaves. This is called Paratingia. Initially, we thought the leaves were flattened in a plane, but they're not. They're in 4 rows. You can see there's some big, broad leaves, the big leaves in a plane. Then on top of these, diagonally, in another row, are these small leaves that occur. So they're actually in a really strange orientation. So they're not really fern-like. We've got the anatomy of the stem. Here's some examples. And here's where it has its very thin wood and a fleshy cortex. And the wood is characteristic. And it turns out the wood is actually like a seed plant. Okay, so it's not a fern kind of wood. All the characteristics, it's growing, has what we call a bifacial vascular cambium in the way that seed plants do, and it's very different from most ferns. We didn't expect that. That was not what we were expecting whatsoever. You see where the secondary xylem is, all the wood in there. So this is showing you some sections. So here's what the cones or the fertile organs look like. And these are thin, ground thin sections through the ash. And they're really, really weird. This group of plants is one of the weirdest things. And these are the individual fertile organs, the sporangia. They're actually produced on a vegetative leaf. And that vegetative leaf can either have rows of these spore-bearing sacs called the microsporangia. But also this plant has what we call megasporangia, where it has megaspores. So it has the male and the microspores and the female, the megaspores, in the same cone. But the megaspores are produced in vertical rows, which is just mad. Plants just don't do this. The organization is, it happens in a way which is just very, very different from other groups of plants. But when we look at the axis, this is one of those cones cut through in 90 degrees to go and have a look at the axis, the central strand. This is what it looks like. It has this omega-shaped strand in here, and this is more characteristics of most fern groups. It's a little bit superficially like a cycad, but actually it's different. And basically, this is very, very different on how this group of plants forms its fertile structure. We can't call them a cone or a strobilus because it turns out they've evolved in a very different way. They're what we call pseudo-strobili because they look like a strobilus, but instead of being their originating from a stem of the plant, this strobilus or pseudo-strobilus has evolved from a leaf. It's bilaterally symmetrical. That makes it really difficult to compare it with other groups of plants. It tells us you can't compare it to other groups of ferns. This doesn't have seeds. It's not a seed plant, but its wood is like seed plants. Its anatomy is not like seed plants. It's intermediate between the two. This is our reconstruction. Here's a typical Roman legionnaire for scale. And he's basically, they grow up to 2 meters, beautiful vegetative leaves, a fertile cone, and like many other tree ferns, it's a completely unique group of plants. And it turns out once you do an evolutionary analysis of them, they don't group where you want. So this is one of our reconstructions of what we thought this plant looks like. All the white arrows are pointing to our paratingia, our reconstruction of this. This one's been drawn in shallow water. I think the water was ephemeral. Most of the time it wasn't in water, but that's something we're currently working on with sedimentologists. And this is what happens when you do an evolutionary analysis. We finally, after all this time, worked out their affinity. This is Devonian ferns in here, some Carboniferous and Devonian ferns. This is a group of where the seed plant originators come. This is a group called our progymnosperms. Progymnosperms are some of our taxa in yellow, our ancestors to seed plants. Here are the oldest seed plants, and our group here are Noeggerathiales. They are related to the ancestral group from which seed plants evolved, and they're basically the most advanced group of a sister group or related living group are living seed plants, and this is where our seed plants evolved. So the bottom line is, we wouldn't have guessed this whatsoever, absolutely unpredictable. And finally, we know what they are. We know that their relevance, as they were one of the closest living groups to seed plants. And it shows previously we thought once seed plants evolved, these things, their ancestors just gradually died out and were outcompeted. It turns out most of them did, these ones here. But our Noeggerathiales actually, again, didn't read the instruction book, and they actually diversified at the same time as the earliest seed plants diversifying, which was completely unexpected. We have lots of other strange groups of plants. This is one called Wudaeophyton, and this is a small vine. This is something where my friend Joseph in the Czech Republic found these specimens, very small, slender plants, often wrapped around bits of other plants. Just here's a really nice one showing you the structure of this. And when we looked at it, the plant, we're following it up, it's all attached. We can trace it all, in connection to each other. Then once he mapped all the different shapes of the leaves, we found out it had a massive range. One species, one individual specimen had 4 different kinds of leaves. The different position on the plant has a different leaf and different structure. And previously, these 4 kinds of leaves had all been given different species names, and they had actually been placed in 2 different genera. It turns out they're actually produced by one species. So it shows us the complications of trying to reconstruct plants and understand what species diversity is from fragmentary fossils. They look different, we classify them different, but it's only when you get the entire plant, you realize actually, like modern plants, they vary, and these ones vary. And it turns out that these 4 different kinds of leaves actually belong to one species. And in this particular case, we have the anatomy of the stem that I'm not going to show you. And it tells us this group was actually a seed plant group that was climbing as a fern. We're also lucky that some of the types of leaves, these ones here, this type and also this type here, they have little sticky buds at the end. You can see here, this is a scanning electron microscope photograph showing this. So this is where the sticky buds are. You see the individual cells, and they get these rounded concretions. And when you do thin sections of them, they just really looks like they're full of some sort of resinous sticky material. So these were designed or evolved to go and climb on and stick onto other plants. So this is our Wudaeophyton plant. And to be honest, there's no way we would have found this in a normal assemblage. So this is really showing us what's happened. We were also, for Wudaeophyton, we looked at where it occurred in the volcanic ash. Normally we study the plants just at the base of the ash over here, but we've been really lucky to be able to go and measure where Wudaeophyton occurs and measure it, the different parts as you go and dig through the ash. And we can, from its material in the ash, we can realize that actually it was climbing on trees that fell over into the ash at different times. It's not just a single horizon. Sometimes the trees were left standing after the ash fall. Sometimes, the initial smothering of ash, a tree fell down days to weeks later and then was buried in upper parts of the soft ash. So we actually get a stratigraphy within the ash as well. And we can realize what happens. And we think in the lower part of the succession, it was growing on a tree fern called Ceronius, which goes to 2.5 meters in height, maybe 3 meters. And in the higher parts, right at the top, there's no way this, on the way we've understood and the materials fell over, this was actually growing on the crown, the emergent canopy, on a group of plants called Cordytes. So this plant was growing up into the canopy and was spreading around like a modern vine or a modern liana. This is really helping us understand the the ecology, and this is the sort of information we just cannot understand from other plant groups. But it turns out they're doing it very much in a similar way to modern climbing epiphytes and climbing plants. It's just really nice to say they were doing it in the Paleozoic, right at the, the Carboniferous-Permian transition. Now, the next group of plants I want to talk about is something that you might be more familiar with, particularly those of you who are interested in Mesozoic floras, so, for example, Jurassic plants. This is a group called the Cycads, and here's some living cycads in a botanical garden showing you a range of morphologies. They're small kind of trees, like in this way, but often shrubby, but they can also be growing along the ground, coming up as more rhizome structures. They are often thought of as a living fossil on the basis that their morphology seems to evolve very slowly in what we call the Bradley-Tellick mode. and is characterized by overall evolutionary stasis. There's this idea that, you know, because the Jurassic cycads look very much like living cycads, and we've got bits and pieces of cycads going back into the, potentially into the Carboniferous, people have been suspecting that they always look the same. I'm not convinced that was the case, and it's been really nice to be able to actually find some of these as plants and go and study them. And this is a paper we're hoping to study, to submit in the imminent future. So I'm just straining my cup of tea to have a bit of a refreshment. So this is our understanding. This is a paper in 2010. My caption probably sums it up. The ingrained botanical view of seed-plant relationships is completely and utterly wrong. But I'm doing it because it's a nice diagram to show. So this is basically a group of pteridosperms, seed ferns from the Carboniferous and Permian. Actually, they're not a single group. There are lots of groups. This is wrong. And cycads potentially evolving from them, maybe starting in the middle Carboniferous evolving, maybe. You know, the problem we really have is that their origin and early evolution is really enigmatic. And this is because we have really limited evidence, and what evidence we have is fragmentary and often poorly preserved. So we're crying out for evidence here of cycads in this time period to find out what they look like and to go and answer this view of their evolution. And basically, the view of this diagram here is basically going back more than 100 years, the views of D.H. Scott and A.C. Seward in 1917 and 1900s. And it's the same, they even reproduce the same pictures. It's just wrong. So we've been looking at this to try and get it right. And we've been very lucky in Wuda that we've got a new family and genus and species of cycad, but we don't just have little bits and pieces. This is Wuda, we've got the whole thing. Here's an example of the apex of a tree. This is about 2.5 meters from the top to bottom. We've got a chunk of it missing, but that's actually on the other side. You break the rock in half, but we just haven't shown it here. This is a photograph taken in the field. Here's an example of one of the crowns of these cycad plants. But unlike modern cycads, the leaves aren't dissected as pinnules, fern-like. They're actually entire, more like a banana palm. And here's some of the photographs of the stem and some of the structures on it. So at the moment, this is a long, slender trunk, 2.5 to 5.5 meters, a crown of up to 36 leaves. They have scars on the stem where the individual leaves have probably fallen off. The leaves are entire, not dissected, of a form called Teneopteris bronyart, and they're things we've known before. And overall, the architecture is similar to some living species of the plant, of the genus Cycas, as we think of this reconstruction. This is one of the key specimens. Actually, it's the best fertile specimen we have. This is a photograph of it, and we've drawn an enlargement to show the key area here. Here's where a trunk comes in, here's the leaves of the crown, and this is where we have our fertile zone. Just to confuse things, though, there's actually break in a bedding plane coming through here, and the bedding plane immediately below it, only a centimeter or so below it, has another cycad crown going the other way. So we've colored this one white here, cycad 1, and here's cycad 2, and it seems to be, you know, these cycads are growing together. When the ash came down, they fell down in random orientations and are preserved. So we're not just basically reconstructing based on one plant. We've got multiple ones, and some of them are vegetative, so no fertile organs, and other ones are fertile. And in this case, the fertile ones, we've only got females. These trees were either male or female. We've only got females. And they have a large zones of leaves, an outer zone with large leaves, an inner zone with small leaves, an outer large, and a whorl of leaves above the apex on the top above the fertile leaves. Very similar to some modern day cycads. Other than leaves are completely different. So aspects are very similar. This is a diagram of the fertile zone. Here are ovules, and this yellow thing here is a fertile leaf. In this group of plants, the seeds, or ovules, I call them seeds, are borne on a vegetative leaf called a sporophyll, and here's what our sporophyll looks like. They don't form a cone, they're produced on the stem, and they're very, very similar to a group, to the modern group of plants, the cycads. But where we do get the cycads, the sporophylls, they're so dense and hard packed together. It's been really hard to understand their morphology and taken lots of preparation. Here's a few photographs. Here's one of the seeds. And these are some photographs of the vegetative leaves, the sporophyll. Here's where we've dug away to get the shape of the sporophyll with some leaves. And here's a more complete sporophyll where the seeds are born at the base. You're not seeing them here. Basically, the specimens have been really difficult to prepare. And where we do see the seeds, they're very large, 10 to 20 millimeters long. The seeds occasionally are divided longitudinally. We're not sure the significance of that. Might be germination valves. Unfortunately, we haven't got an anatomical preservation of the fertile zones. We're still looking for that. We've got enough morphology to work out their structures and what they look like. But we are lucky to have their stem anatomy. Here's one of the stems going through the different parts. And basically, this is basically where lots of the leaf scars are. Or each of these is where a leaf would come in, this hole here through the stem. This is a section cut through approximately this orientation, showing little packets or parcels of wood. And each of these holes here is where a leaf trace, a vascular strand coming to a leaf comes out. Where we go and get the anatomy in the sections, we've got the internal structures with the sclerotic tissues in. You can see here we've actually got some of these vascular tissues. We've also got different anatomical features going to show the wood. So this is the first time we've got the plant with the anatomy of the stems to really confirm they definitely are cycads. They're not something different. They're really within the Cycadaceae. And this is something that's really unusual. Living cycads, they produce their leaf traces. So this is the stem and cross section. This is the central vascular tissue. And this is where a leaf comes out of this hole here. But it has the vascular tissues come straight from the stem in a direct way. But cycads also are a unique group of plants that they have additional vascular tissues that comes into the leaf. But it doesn't come in a direct course. It comes out on the opposite side, and then it goes all the way round and comes out this way. It's called a girdling leaf trace. We're not really sure why they do that. They do it. It's a diagnostic feature. And it turns out when you look at it, here's a direct leaf trace coming out through our packets of wood. Here's another one where the leaf trace is actually split, where the vascular strand has come out at a different level and it's splitting here. Here's one in the longitudinal section where you can see our vascular strand is splitting. And these basically have girdling leaf traces. Our fossil cycad has it just the same as our living cycads. And as I said, just like shortly. Just to go and give a kind of example, it's not just one species. We've got lots of other plants. Here's the crown of a Morathialian fern, and it's got our fertile structures. This is one which we're going to be reconstructing soon. This is something where we have some really fantastic materials. This is a reconstruction undertaken by my colleague Dan, showing her material. And these are just to go and show you that we can reconstruct all of the species given what we want to do. I'm going to give some conclusions now, and I'm going to be available for questions at the end. So our Wuda flora, it really is spectacular. It's presenting an unrivaled view into an early Permian terrestrial ecosystem. And it's really revolutionizing our understanding of lots of different things. It's telling us so much more about the composition of the early Permian Carthasian flora. It's telling us so much more information about the morphology and anatomy and the evolution of major flank groups. It's giving us wonderful insights into paleoecology, spatial distribution of early Permian floras, because it's preserved in situ. It hasn't been moved and pushed away. We're not having to spend years reconstructing our plants. We've just got them. And it's really helping us to understand our relationship with the equatorial Euro-American and Carthasian floras. And also, it really brings into mind that the Carboniferous and Permian, particularly the boundary between these two systems, was a real time of immense change. And we now think this is driven by volcanism, or part of it is. And in this case, volcanism and astronomical cycles, the Milankovitch cyclicity combined and triggered a major shift into glacial conditions around the Permian Carboniferous boundary. And this really then triggered advances of high latitude glaciations in Gondwana. We see a massive sea level drop, a regression, and that led to colonization of areas that were previously continental shelf environments that you saw in our reconstructions. We also see a period to most of the early Permian, the Acelian stage, cooler and drier equatorial climates. Now, one thing is really unusual. We see cooling for a relatively long period of time, but normally in volcanism, the cooling is very short-lived and it happens at the start before the large amounts of CO2 build up and give us volcanic warming. So one final question is, why did the cooling last so long at the Carboniferous-Permian boundary? And it clearly was a time that it did lots of opportunities for plants to grow and develop. And I'll stop there after a 50-minute talk to go and give us time for questions and answers and discussion, should anybody want that. And I'll stop sharing now.
Thanks, Jason. That was a really interesting talk. I'll just stop the recording before we